Melusine by Lynne Chapter 7, The Stone Head. Roger was carsick on the way back. This was particularly unheard of, and even the twins were nice to him. Well, he had managed not to throw up inside the car, for which they were probably quite grateful. When Polly used to be carsick, she had never bothered to ask for the car to be stopped, and they all knew what the alternative was. After Roger had crawled back into the car, feeling somewhat better but still pretty fragile, Emma sat in the middle without being told to, so that he could have the outside place near the window. She even put an arm around him and addressed him in unusually gentle tones.
"What poor Wada feeling, Wad and Den? Wada want to put a head on on Eddie's shoulder."
It was an indication of her concern for him that she spoke to him in Wadi, the language of their childhood, which consisted largely of D's and O's and W. It was only used between them now, on the increasingly rare occasions when they were feeling fond of each other and wanted to say something soppy that they naturally couldn't say in their normal voices. When spoken fast enough, Wadi was still a secret language incomprehensible to their Dod and Mod, which made its non-sentimental use also occasionally desirable. But now it only meant that Emma was genuinely sorry for him, and he felt sorry for himself, to tell the truth. It was so unusual for him to feel all woozy and sick. Maybe it was having two rather scary experiences in one day. Before he drifted off to sleep with his head on Emma's shoulder, he asked himself why watching Melusine moving to the snake charm music should have frightened him. He had no answer. Melusine's father must have known a quicker way home than Roger's, because by the time they got back to the Serpes vehicle, an old heap of a farm pickup was already standing outside the back of the chateau. Roger, who felt much better after his sleep, hurried around to the goat pen to find Melusine halfway through milking, using the old random catch system in his absence. He stood some distance behind her, looking at her critically. She looked just as she had when he'd first seen her black pigtail hanging down to her waist, the diamond-patterned t-shirt now badly in need of a wash. She'd had time to change then, since getting back from La Rochelle. What had she been wearing there? He couldn't remember. Something green. He screwed up his eyes, remembering her as she had stood in the square. She had looked nice, but now she looked the way he knew her best. And it was easy to forget she had scared him, and just climb the fence and creep up behind her. Boo! But she didn't even twitch. She must have heard him coming. Despite all the noise the goats were making.
Hello,
she said calmly without looking around.
How are you? Where you are be? I'll be in La Rochelle, same as you, Roger said. I saw you.
Her whole body jerked, and the bucket tottered. He bent and grabbed it to steady it, and their hands, seizing its rim at the same place, touched. He looked into her face. It was white.
What's the matter? Rien? Rien! Laissez-moi!
She almost shouted in a shrill voice. He let go of the pail and stood up. I was only trying to help, he said. He felt hurt, really hurt, that she'd spoken to him like that. She put her head against the goat's flank and went on milking while he stood there. There was a silence between them. He felt just like walking away, but he didn't. Instead, he said, So what if I saw you?
Where was I there for... Where I was there you see me?
She asked in a muffled tone.
In that little square. You were dancing. Comment?
He couldn't think of the word for dance, so he did a clumsy imitation of her swaying movements, trying to make a joke of it. She stared at him, her mouth open, her round eyes wide, so that he could see the whites all around the black irises.
I do it like this? Of course, you remember. The girl played, he mimed the flute, and you danced.
And he wiggled his hips and tried to make the figure-8 movement with his head. Suddenly, she jumped up, snatching up the pail, and faced him. He was horrified to see that tears had sprung into her eyes.
Commence! Je ne sais pas faire car.
Never, never!" And turning, she ran away from him into the dairy, leaving the stool on its side in the straw. Roger stood stunned for a moment. Had she dared to call him a liar? But when he picked up the pail and went after her, he found the dairy door bolted from the inside. Putting his ear to it, he was shocked to hear her sobbing. "Melusine!" he called sharply. She was frightening him again, in quite a different way this time. "Open the door!" He banged on it with his fist. "Ouvre la porte!" The sobbing stopped. He banged again, commandingly, the way his mother occasionally banged on the twins' door at home when they'd locked themselves in. It was a knock demanding that the door be opened, and sure enough, after a subdued rustling of straw, the top part of the door was opened a little, and Melusine's sullen, tear-stained face appeared. "Let me in," he said shortly. The lower half was unbolted, and he walked into the half-dark, milk and goat-smelling room. Melusine stood aside. She hung her head and looked limp and submissive, not like her. It made him feel strange, as if he'd done something so awful to her that he'd defeated her somehow. He wanted to put his arm around her, as Emma had with him in the car, but he sensed she would flinch away if he tried. Instead, he went and sat on a bench and said, "Please come here." She came, slowly dragging her feet. He noticed that she wore leather boots, laced to her ankles, old and cracked without socks. Her legs were scratched and muddy. The sight disturbed him because they looked like a boy's legs, except that they definitely weren't. They made him feel suddenly terribly sorry for her, even more than her tears. He patted the bench beside him, and she sat down, not looking at him, wiping her wet face with the palms of her hands, leaving smears. "What's wrong? What did I say wrong?" she sniffed. "I do not like you say. No, never." He opened his mouth to contradict her, then shut it again. "Okay," he said. "I must have just thought it was you." She gave him half a smile, and then looked down into her lap again. They sat for some time in silence. The sun sent a beam in through the top of the door, so bright and square and full of dust it looked solid. Outside, the goats bleated, and inside, the flies whined. Several flies landed on them, but only Roger brushed them away. Melusine sat motionless, as if she were asleep, while the flies crawled over her knees. It made Roger feel as if she'd gone away somehow. After a while, he stood up. He picked up the pail and emptied it into the churn. "Come on," he said. "We'd better finish the milking." At supper that night, Roger's father said, "Today, we went on a you-lot outing. Tomorrow, we're going on a me outing." The twins groaned. "Oh, no, it's churches, isn't it?" "It is indeed. This area's stiff with them, marvelous Romanesque ones. And before you say anything, the day after it's you-lot time again." "Verte Venice," he added mysteriously. "What on earth's that?" "It's the canals, miles of them, with boats and little islands to picnic on. But first," he made a fiend's face. "Churches," they moaned, but resignedly this time. "Right. With a good French restaurant lunch in the middle," said their mother, to forestall more groans. "I deserve a rest from cooking." As always, on days when they were going on a parent choice outing, there was no delay the next morning. There was no need to pack the car or take a picnic, so they were ready to go right after breakfast. The bad thing for Roger was that he'd overslept and missed milking, so he set off feeling uncomfortable about not having helped or seen Melusine. He particularly wanted to see her this morning to make sure she was back to her normal bossy self, but his father was raring to go and in no mood to wait. Anyway, Roger didn't want to give the twins anything to send him up about. It started off as a typical boring dad day. He had all the churches for miles around circled on his tourist map with red marker pen, and to drive the children mad, he showed it to them, casually remarking that they were going to do them all. As the map looked as if it had measles, there was marked gloom in the back seat until their mother reassured them. "Don't worry, kids. I couldn't take more than 4 myself without a complete collapse." The 3 of them leaned over the back of her seat and hugged her thoroughly, while their father said, "No culture, none of you." The first church was quite the dullest Roger had ever seen. To begin with, it was empty, completely empty of everything. No pews, no altar, no tombs. Roger secretly liked some tombs, especially the ones with crusaders in armor on them. All there was stone walls, crumbling pillars, and dusty flagstone floors. And an echo, "Ooh-ah," said Polly like a ghost. And "ooh-ah," went the echo, much more so, filling the vaulted ceiling with eerie, hollow sound. The next church, several villages away, was much the same, and they'd got bored with making ghost noises by then. "Why aren't they being used, Dad?" Roger asked. "Why are they in such bad repair is what I'd like to know," muttered his father. "I always thought the French were so particular about the upkeep of their historical monuments." "I don't see how you could think that, living in our chateau," said his mother. "Where are the pews?" asked Emma, who wanted to sit down. Maybe people come and steal them," said Polly. "You couldn't walk off with a pew, stupid," said Emma. "Oh, do stop bothering," hissed Roger in disgust. "I beg your pardon," said their father, emerging from his book with his eyebrows well raised. The girls goggled. "It's Waddy for bicker, Dad," said Polly. But at least it stopped them. They went out to play, pocket mastermind in the car. "I'm going too," said Roger. "This isn't interesting. It's even emptier than the ballroom in the chateau." His father lowered the guidebook and gave him a sharp, interested look. "Have you seen it, then?" he asked. "Yeah, Melusine showed me it over the whole place, pretty near." "You didn't tell us." His father sounded exactly like Polly when she thought she'd been left out of something. They had a marvelous lunch by a river after the third, and they all devoutly hoped final church. There were red checkered tablecloths, tiny crisp circles of French bread with lots of butter. Roger always sprinkled salt on his. And as many delicious thin-fried potatoes as you wanted with your mini steak. The waitress came back with refilled baskets of them 3 times until their dad called a halt. He didn't say no when the manager kept coming back with the large bottle of house wine to refill the grown-ups' glasses, though. Everyone was happy and rather sleepy after that, but their father was stern and dragged them all off to one last church. It was the longest drive to this one, and all the children dozed off at the back of the car to be woken by their father exclaiming, "Ah, now there's a real humdinger. The guidebook said it was something special. Wonderful Romanesque carvings." The twins wanted to stay in the car, but something different about the building drew Roger out. It wasn't so much a complete church as a ruin with a tower attached. It was the tower that got him. It reminded him of the one at Bois-sur-Paix, the same size and shape except for the carvings. They were outside, not in. There was nothing inside except bat and bird droppings, and a black look to the walls, as if there had been a fire. But all around the outside, under the eaves of the conical roof, were projections of stone, worn by time and weather, carved into strange and interesting shapes. Some of them were animals, some flowers, some fanciful designs that weren't exactly like anything Roger could think of, but most of them were people's heads. Some were grotesque, gargoyle-looking things with hideous bulbous noses and tongues sticking out. Others looked quite like ordinary people. "Were these all done by the same person, Dad?" "I wouldn't say so, would you? They're all different styles." They moved slowly around the tower together, gazing upward, calling each other's attention to this head or that. "There's a funny one, really funny, like a comedian trying to make you laugh by pulling a face." "Oh, look at that old woman. She's just like the one in the bread shop in the village." "Yes, some of them are real local types that haven't changed." "How old are they, Dad?" 11th, 12th century. Wow, 800 years old. After one circuit of the tower and the ruins, Roger's father sat down on a grassy bank to read his guidebook. Roger decided to go around once more. It was on this second trip, when he was by himself, that he saw her. He stopped dead, staring upward. How had he missed noticing her the first time? None of the others were like her. For one thing, she wasn't so weather-worn as most of them. Her features were still sharp, as if she'd been carved recently. Unlike the others, she was young. Almost a child. Not an old or at least ageless sort of person. Her hair was parted in the middle, and the stone smoothed over the flat plains. And was there? Yes, there was. A ridge of stone beside her neck that could be the top of a plate. It wasn't just the hair that made her so familiar to him. It was like looking at a recent portrait. Her round stone eyes, wide mouth, thin face. It was just her. It couldn't be, but it was. And even as Roger stood there gaping at the little stone head, something even more incredible happened. His father came strolling around the curve of the tower, his nose still in the guidebook, and said, "Listen, Rog, something odd here that'll interest you. Coincidence, I didn't notice it because the church, before it fell down, was called something else. Do you know what this tower is called? It's called Melusine." And that's the end of chapter 7.